My name? Well, that's not really important right now. Besides, a person's name never really defines who they are. I find myself here on the island of Altis. It's a shitty little rock of an island floating out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. An island with a practically non-existent government due to the almost constant state of civil war and rebellion. Many of the small villages on Altis are now nothing more than hollow shells of what they used to be. These days, most villages are really nothing more than ghost towns. Signs of fighting are almost everywhere you look. However, this is nothing new for Altis. All through history, the story of Altis could be written in blood. First by small clans fighting over prime lands with crude stone implements, followed by a more modern and civilized culture using swords, clubs, or spears as their primary means of settling a debate between them. With only brief periods of peace and prosperity in between times of war, not much has changed on Altis, except for the methods and tools used by the inhabitants of the island. These days, things are controlled by fear, money, and of course, by the gun. Crime is at an all-time high. Drugs run almost unchecked through the streets. Leaving a vehicle unattended for even a short amount of time will almost always guarantee a quick change in ownership. People are constantly being robbed, kidnapped, held for ransom, and often kill each other over some of the most mundane reasons. Although there is a noticeable lack of any type of government establishment, some law and order does still remain. Many of the people I have encountered have had past military, militia, PMC, or law enforcement experience. There are usually several established police officers around at any given time, with some lesser ranking cops everyone likes to call pub cops generally in tow. So far, my experience with the police of Altus has not been a bad one. I have found them to be quite courteous, professional, polite, and even helpful from time to time. I've only been arrested and sent to jail on a couple of occasions. Once was on my first job as a truck driver. My second week in Altus, I had unknowingly taken a truck full of stolen electronics. I left from Kavala on my way to Solanco Freight Yard. On my way through Kavala, I decided to stop at the local market to acquire some supplies for the trip, as it was a quite long one. I was busted before I even had the opportunity to get back into the truck. The other and most recent time I was arrested was for brandishing a firearm and discharging said firearm in public. That night started as many other nights often do, with a bad decision. I was talked into sharing some of the locally made whiskey with one of the townsfolk. One drink turned into two, then three, and you get the picture from there. Soon I found myself at Boomer's Bar. I spent nearly $10,000 on whiskey that night, which really isn't as bad as it seems given the low value of currency on Altus. Next thing I know, I was waking up in jail. It was later explained to me that during my drinking spree, I had wandered over to Kavala Square and started sharing my night's plunder with a few others. Apparently, even a cop partook in the refreshments that I had offered. I wouldn't doubt if it was a pub cop. Now, I'm not particularly fond of snakes, and I guess one of those little bastards came slithering by. I took it upon myself to rid the city of the vermin. Not a wise decision. I pulled out my weapon in front of 3 police officers and 2 trainees and began unloading. I got through maybe 10 rounds before being tased and arrested. I'll tell you one thing, waking up in jail having only the faintest memory of the night before, in a place that you've only been in for less than 3 weeks, is not a fun one. Jail in Altus is a humiliating place to find yourself. Several children's toys are in place at the yard, which officers humorously call exercise equipment. I think it's degrading. On top of that, one of the inmates who was in at the same time as I was died from dehydration. He was calling out, but his calls, his pleas for mercy were unheeded. There is a skeleton of what I assumed to be a former prisoner who was left to the same fate, just behind the children's slide. One thing for sure, the liberals back home would have a heyday with the apparent abuse of prisoners by the GDP. Having lived here for almost 2 months, if I were asked to describe Altus, I would begin by explaining it culturally as a vetrigated mix of people from all around the world. More than a few people have suggested several sites of interest for me to go and check out, as I become familiar with the island. Signs of influence from various countries exist almost everywhere you go. From ancient days long past, items such as a few old degraded statues, and larger man-made structures, such as a Cumberland amphitheater which exists between Calathina and Pifkis Bay, more than likely built by the Greeks, one of the neighbors to the north of Altis. It's old, but it is by far not the oldest man-made structure on Altis. There's also a number of Italian-style castles, one just on the outskirts of Kavala, the capital city, and the other built at the highest point of Altis known as Thronos. More recent remains are scattered around Altis. Signs of outside influence exist everywhere from the not-so-distant days of the past. Both the Russians and British Empire held interest in the island at one time or another, either because of the large quantities of oil and minerals varying anything from as mundane as iron or copper to the more delicate and highly desirable diamonds that are locked away just underneath the soil, waiting to be unearthed from the rocky tombs by whoever happens to be in control of the island at any given time. Or perhaps the raw materials such as lumber, sulfur, and of course vast quantities of easily accessible salt from the flats on the northeastern part of the island. Altis itself reminds me of a mix between the Old West and the slums of Guatemala. Throughout the island, the smell of salt water acts as a constant reminder of just exactly where you are. In the more populated areas, there is the relentless smell of constantly decomposing organic waste, which is truly disturbing. This is due to the lack of modern plumbing. Waste is generally collected in areas which could be more or less considered as septic pits or leach fields. As if that wasn't bad enough, solid waste is generally tossed out into the streets and left to decompose. It stinks up the cities and is almost unbearable. All in all, there's a general lack of any type of effective trash disposal. It was difficult for me to keep from upchucking my lunch when I first stepped off the helicopter and onto the island of Altis. The overwhelming stench washed over me like a wave of nauseating gas. The smell of trash mixed with the miasma of raw sewage, which clings to your body and skin, are almost too much to bear. Eventually, as with most things, you learn to first tolerate the stench, and eventually you become so used to the smell that it is hardly noticed. One thing I will mention about the island that is actually good is they are sufficient with their own power sources. Plenty of wind-powered turbines scatter across the hills, in addition to solar panels, provide more than enough power for the small population. So, by this point, you may be asking yourself, what brings me, a 28-year-old from central Wyoming, to this island paradise with its almost unbridled crime, mostly deserted lands, and the not-so-pleasant smell? Well, that, my friends, is a long story. For now, I will leave it off with a short and sweet finish. You could imagine this as some sort of classic Hollywood story. Simply put, I am here for revenge. I am looking for the man who killed almost my entire family and kidnapped my little brother. Although I yearn for the day I can sink the blade of my knife into that bastard's heart, more importantly, I am here looking for my little brother, who he took shortly after he had finished off our father, mother, and sister. My journey following his trail has been tough and full of disappointing leads, but 2 weeks ago, while I was looking for him in Germany, as I was sitting at the table, lost in my own thoughts, with a somewhat staticky version of Mozart's Für Elise coming over the ancient radio in my hostel room, I had received a somewhat large envelope along with my meal. Within the envelope was a fuzzy photograph and a small rectangular object. The photograph was the kind that had looked like it had been taken with an old cell phone, but it was without a doubt the photo of the man who I had been looking for. He was standing right there in the foreground on some sort of a crate, but the thing which really caught my eye was just behind him in the background. Barely noticeable, but yet unmistakable, was the thing which made my brain dump adrenaline into my body like a broken storm valve. It was the image of my brother. My heart was pumping hard, my hands shaking, and sweat was beginning to ooze out of every pore in my body, but I had hardly noticed any of it. There, standing next to Zed like some sort of obedient dog or protege admiring his teacher, was my brother. It was him without a doubt, just 3 years older and noticeably taller. He would be 16 now, and in the photo, he held that same look of admiration that I used to have when I was around my father and Zed. It was quite obvious that Zed had not told him the truth behind what had actually happened to the rest of our family. Once I came to my senses after some unknowing amount of time which seemed to stretch out into eternity, I had finally noticed a return address. Located on the high right corner of the envelope in big black bold letters, was a residential address located on the island of Altis in the capital city of Kavala. I had heard little about the island, but I knew almost nothing about it. What little I did know about Altis was that it had been undergoing a stage of revolution, military coup, or possibly even a full-out civil war. After some contemplation, I remembered the small rectangular shape that was still laden within the envelope. I tumbled it out onto the table. The wax cube about the size of a bar of soap laid in front of me. I took the wax rectangle in my hands and began to break off little chunks of it. Contained within was a house key and a small baggie of heroin. I didn't understand why my contact, who will remain anonymous for now, would have included the drug in the first place, but I knew it would eventually play an important role in my near future. Knowing Zed as well as I did, it didn't surprise me in the least to learn that he was on Altis. Anywhere there was a conflict, that man had a tendency to show up. I never knew Zed's true name, and in all the time on the compound, I had honestly never thought to ask. Even though it has been many years since I have seen him, I recognized his face the moment I opened that envelope. And why not? He is the man who, along with my father, taught me everything I know. Weeks upon weeks of grueling survival training, navigational and tactical skills constantly being driven into my brain with a seemingly unrelentless force was stressful, but I learned quickly, to say the least. Shooting in the desert next to the lake near the compound was a skill that I had learned and picked up very quickly and with little effort. It soon became my favorite activity and was a second nature to me. I got quite good at it surprisingly fast. I was fortunate enough, at least in my own opinion, to have access to a variety of weapons and gear that most people my age had only seen in actual combat, video games, or at the least in movies or on television. I never put much thought into how that equipment made it into our hands, but if I had to guess, I suppose there may have been a few midnight requisitions at the nearby army base, or perhaps my father and Zed had maintained a few of their former contacts. A week after leaving Germany, I now found myself on Altis in the city of Kavala. The key that had formerly been contained in the wax belonged to a house located just behind the police headquarters, a location which will prove to be a great strategical benefit to me. And not only will I be able to observe the behavior of the GDP, but also begin to learn who the troublemakers are. It may not always be the case, but usually the drug addicts and ruffians are the easiest type of people to manipulate into getting what you want. With being so near to the police headquarters, I will have a plentitude of criminal scum to profile just yards away from my front door. While I grow anxious to get on with things, find my brother, and kill that bastard Zed, with no new signs or hint of his whereabouts over the last 2 months, I do my best to blend in. I have earned a decent income performing various jobs around the island, from the simple task of picking apples out in the blazing sun to driving delivery trucks around the island. One thing I have definitely learned really quick about driving trucks around the island of Altis is that you are not safe from the local rebels. On my second or maybe third job driving truck, I saw two heavily armed camouflage off-road pickups heading in my general direction, and sure enough, within seconds, they had me stopped on the side of the road and robbed me of my day's income. Nearly $100,000 lost. Not all rebel groups on Altis have a bad reputation, but I had the unfortunate luck of crossing paths with a group who were the type who would shoot you just as soon as tell you the time of day. Needless to say, I cooperated, and I felt fortunate enough to have escaped with my life. After that day, I refused to go around unarmed, even within the city of Kavala. Fortunately enough for me, my contact had left me a small care package underneath a loose floorboard in the house, which he had acquired on my behalf. And in that package was a .45 caliber pistol, simply known as a 4.5. And surprisingly enough, it was made in the good old US of A. It reminds me a lot of my SIG 227 tactical that I left behind me at home, and usually it accompanies me on my journeys through Altis. I have made a small connection with one of the local militia groups and may be joining their ranks. They are here for the people of Altis and so far seem to have a good reputation amongst the people, with an exception to the local police, of course. I may be able to use my skills to benefit the group and in turn learn more about the island and its inhabitants, ultimately leading me to my goal. I will go under the alias of MajorPain 762, as MajorPain was my nickname, and 7.62 was my favorite caliber of rifle. During my time on this island over the last 2 months, I have done a few things that I am not proud of by any means, and it may seem like a bit of a cop-out, but here on Altis, with its lack of morals and no sense of responsibility, it is just the way of the island. However, I will get into more of that later. Sounds like the cops are having, well, issues again with the locals.